This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor John Fabian Witt his book, Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History. Professor Witt is the Alan H. Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law at Yale Law School. He also holds a dual appointment in the Yale History Department, and he is a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow. He is the author of two previous books, Patriots and Cosmopolitans, Hidden Histories of American Law, and The Accidental Republic, Crippled Working Men, Destitute Widows, and the Remaking of American Law. He has also written for New York Times, Slate, Harvard Law Review, and the Yale Law Journal, among many other publications. And I should also mention at the outset that this book we're going to be discussing, Lincoln's Code, has recently been named as one of the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2012. Professor Witt, I'm glad to have you.
Richard, it's a delight to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So your book is entitled Lincoln's Code. But you have a remarkable history before the ordering of Lincoln's Code, before its enactment in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, in which you detail the early American republic's interaction with the laws of war. And you state it begins with a Declaration of Independence. From that document, we declare ourselves as a republic that will fight its wars underneath the laws of war, as those have been constructed and put together at that time. Sketch for us the history of this interaction with the laws of war up through Lincoln's Code.
Well, I wanted to start before the Civil War, which is the Civil War is the core of the book, but I wanted to start before the Civil War to get a sense of what Lincoln was up against when he engaged with the law of war tradition in the midst of the Civil War, and I found myself, as historians are often finding themselves dragged further and further back, and so the book starts in the Revolution, even in some sense in the 7 Years' War, a couple decades before. And what I found was that from the very beginning of the Republic, even before there's a republic to speak of, American soldiers, statesmen, and lawyers are grappling with the international laws of war, the law of nations as it went in the late 18th century, and trying to make sense of it. And they're working with some of the same materials that 21st century statesmen find themselves working with today.
John, let me ask you this question. Early on, what's the situation of America relative to the other great powers? How does this influence the way they're trying to use the laws of war for their advantage, which this is a part of your narrative, is how nations try and selectively piece together or choose in the treaties they make the laws that they will follow, I guess maybe we should say with reservations, according to their own strengths. But America early on faces a lot of distinct challenges. You write about George Washington and the insistence on neutrality vis-a-vis the French, and then also John Marshall's jurisprudence developing these rules about neutral shipping, all of which kind of underscoring how the laws of war are both a protection but also a way to further our own interest as a young nation. But let me ask you this question as well. How are the laws of war at this time? I mean, what are the sources? What are they trying to do vis-a-vis war in terms of guiding military policy, et cetera?
Well, these are all great questions. There's a lot there. Let me unpack a little bit of it. I think the most important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the founders and the laws of war is that for the Revolutionary Republic, qualifying for the laws of war, that is, being a state for whom the laws of war are relevant, is one of the central goals of the Revolution, is to become a state. So that invoking the laws of war between 1775 and 1783 is something that American statesmen are at great pains to do whenever they can. Because the British claim, especially for the first 4 or 5 years of the war, is that the laws of war have nothing to do with this conflict. This is a criminal uprising by a bunch of upstart conspirators on the western coast of the Atlantic Ocean. So Washington from 75 on is at great pains to invoke the laws of war and insist on their relevance. And that tradition, this identity that American statesmen want to take on, persists into the early republic. It's in tension though with one of the central conundrums of the laws of war, and this central conundrum is a theme that runs through the entire book, and I think runs through the problem of the laws of war for all Western states for the last several hundred years, and that's this: that the central foundation of rules in armed conflict is the temporary suspension of the firm conviction that you're in the right. That's why soldiers get to shoot at other soldiers and are not subject to criminal prosecution so long as they follow the rules internal to armed conflict. Each side agrees, for the purposes of regulating the conflict, to not treat the other side as criminals for just engaging in the war itself. That's the classic structure of the 18th and 19th century laws of war. And what that structure does is it asks each side, and it asked American soldiers and statesmen, to suspend at just the moment of greatest mobilization the firm conviction that they were in the right. And that is an enormously hard thing to do. And so that's the tension. We see that tension from the very start. Even though American statesmen are claiming and invoking the laws of war, there's a good deal of frustration with the constraints that the laws of war purport to impose. Now, you also asked about the sources. I mean, one question is, what is this thing, the laws of war, that we're even talking about? And that's a useful thing to get out at the very outset of this conversation, because there are no treaties to talk about. No multilateral treaties like the ones we're familiar with today. There's no Geneva Conventions. There's no Hague Convention. What you have is a body of customary norms that have been articulated and refined by European jurists, going back into the early modern period. People like Vittoria, Grotius, Vattel. These are European jurists who wrote big multi-volume treatises, pretty obscure, and read by theorists, philosophers, and some diplomats in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And it's a contested body of norms. It's a set of ideas about how best to manage conflict. I mean, by the 18th and 19th centuries, it really does rest on this idea that civilized conflict requires that the parties set aside the criminal laws, set aside their conviction of justice for the purposes of regulating the war. So there's agreement on that, but there's lots of disagreement on the details, and much of the political controversy about the laws of war arises out of the fact that there's not unanimity among the jurists on the fine questions. So there's a lot of room for argumentation and dispute and controversy, and that's what the book tries to lay out in the early parts of American history. Is a huge amount of controversy over these questions, but not ignoring the domain. See, that's the interesting feature. You could imagine that an area of the law that's so open-ended and so open to contending controversies might be an area of the law that people just decided wasn't worth the candle. It's pointless if you can't figure it out. And yet we see repeated efforts to engage by the United States and by some of its enemies. And so that's the dynamic the book is interested in. This is the open-endedness, the susceptibility to controversy and contestedness, but also continued engagement.
It was interesting. I mean, as I was reading that too, I'm thinking, how the laws of war maintain their credible basis and posture amongst nations, given this sort of the way they are used, and the way nations try and use them to their own advantage. I was wondering as well. You write about reprisals, and this seems to be or the threat of reprisals, and this seems to be a mechanism by which the laws of war are enforced among nations in conflict with one another. That should you mistreat our prisoners of war, you can expect likewise. Should you execute them unfairly, or should you now decide that a whole class of our soldiers should be summarily executed or not be part of prisoner exchanges or things like this, that you can expect the same. And is this the reprisal aspect? I thought was significant because at one level you would be one nation would be doing something like executing innocent men or prisoners, and yet this was always seen as justified, I thought. And this is a part of our own Revolutionary War strategy. George Washington, as you write, is very clear to British generals what will happen if American soldiers are improperly treated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one thing that's true is that the laws of war are a pretty brutal and dismaying area of the law. I mean, warfare is a terrible thing, and the laws of war don't make the effort, don't even try to remove the brutality, or all of it at least, from war. It's an effort to constrain and limit some of war's consequences, and this is something that pacifists never cease to point out in their critique of the laws of war. The laws of war for them are an apology, an elaborate apology for a brutal and barbaric practice. And so one of the themes that I had a great time finding in the history and then trying to bring out in the right way in the book was the I don't know, should I call it the far left critique, or maybe it's a far right critique? I don't know what it is. It's a peace society's critique, articulated most powerfully in U.S. history in an 1845 speech by Charles Sumner, the future senator from Massachusetts, who in the 1840s is experimenting with pacifism, and he announces that soldiers are criminals. There's no other way to think about it if you're a Christian, is Sumner's view. So there is that tradition of critique, and the reprisal is a great example of why you have that tradition. The problem for the laws of war is there's no neutral enforcer. This is why the jurists insisted that belligerent states needed to suspend the conviction that they were in the right. And the reason is there's nobody to sort out who is in the right. And so the reprisal is what stands in for the absence of a neutral third-party adjudicator. The reprisal is participant enforcement of the norms, and it means retaliation for violations by the other side. The interesting feature of reprisal and retaliation is that it's both the only mechanism for enforcing the rules, and it's also, and the jurists, but also the soldiers are painfully aware of the following. It's also one of the great risks in war, because your reprisal is going to be seen by the other side as another violation, which is going to justify another reprisal, which in turn will justify still a third reprisal. And the downward spiral of reprisals is something that everybody is deeply, deeply concerned with in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
So you want to hold that threat, right? You want to hold the threat. Hopefully, you don't have to use it.
Right, exactly. That's the problem. And there's one of the moments that I had was really interested to find is in the summer and fall of 1781. The Continental Congress is becoming increasingly frustrated with British conduct toward American prisoners and toward American cities and towns. The war has moved to the south, and it's gotten increasingly ugly. The no man's land in the Hudson Valley is a terrifying place. And the Continental Congress, led by James Madison on this point, is prepared to issue a really terrifying retaliation order, which does threaten this downward spiral of violence. And it's at just that moment that
and James Madison is behind that, right?
Yes, Madison.
That was incredible.
Yeah, and it's just that moment that Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. And so it's a really interesting thing to think, what might the American Revolution have come to look like? We have some sense of it from the brutal conflict in the South between patriot militias and loyalist militias. But retaliation is both the way you enforce these laws and also the real threat to these laws.
So let me, we've been discussing kind of the, you mentioned some of the Enlightenment thinkers behind the laws of war and their attempts to limit the horrifying aspects of war, which they maybe can succeed at doing between, say, European states in the 18th century. It seems that's kind of the paradigmatic case, to hold it just to the battlefield between massed armies. But yet America confronts these new realities. And you mentioned the reality on the continent of the French army fighting in Spain, the Peninsular War, confronting guerrillas there, and kind of this new mode of warfare, maybe not new, but seemingly new, relatively new, of fighting guerrillas, irregulars who engage in all manner of tactics to try and press their claims. And so America confronts this in the Indian Wars in the South. You know Andrew Jackson's campaigns, particularly as he goes into Florida and fights the Seminoles, and the Seminole Wars, which continued into the 1840s. That sort of warfare. And then we also have the Mexican War, which you talk about, and the rise of military commissions has America's way to deal with guerrilla-style fighting. That was a favorite tactic of the Mexican government. And the way we deal with it in the military commissions, you spend a lot of time talking about, which I thought was significant given the use of military commissions or the debate about military commissions in the post 9/11 security environment, and yet the genesis seems to be the Mexican War. Talk about that and what's trying to be achieved. And this, I mean, I guess this idea that you really can't bound warfare, or how do you fight an enemy that will use tactics that one side sees as truly barbaric, even though, as you also document, America's hands or forces were not clean.
Let me talk about that in two ways. First, let me talk about a little bit about Andrew Jackson and Indian Wars, which, as you say, are a really important example of the kinds of irregular armed conflict that the United States is engaged in, from the smart. The kinds of things that Max Boot calls the small wars. And then let me talk about the military commissions in Mexico, which are also really interesting and as you say, have really important resonance today. One of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was the history of international law strikes me as a really important and interesting topic. But it's not one that's been, with important exceptions, it's not one that's been especially well written so far. And one of the reasons is when writers go to think about the history of international law, they turn to the jurists who self-consciously operate in the tradition. Now, it's not surprising that you can then find a tradition that's pretty robust if all you do is follow the international lawyers. I was more interested in trying to figure out what the social and political history and military history of the laws of war are. Do the laws of war have traction on the ground in particular political or military moments of controversy or crisis? Those are the kinds of things that I wanted to get into. And Andrew Jackson strikes me as an incredibly important figure in that story. You'll not find Andrew Jackson in the histories of international law in the United States. And you won't find him because he's someone who has disdain at any number of junctures for the whole idea of international law. Now, this is an important part of the American tradition of thinking about international law, is contempt and disdain. We have this from very early on, alongside the point that I tried to describe earlier of statesmen claiming the law of nations as something that will validate the identity of the United States as an independent nation state. But we also have this tradition of disdain, and you see it really nicely in Andrew Jackson. He's someone who brings populist contempt for the niceties of the European pointy-headed international lawyers. I mean, that's his view. At one point, his partisans describe international lawyers as what they call learned Pufendorfs. They're just mocking the European tradition by referencing a 17th century jurist named Samuel Pufendorf.
Liberty Fund knows him well.
Exactly. The kinds of people, right? But it turned. What I was interested with Jackson has goes into Florida, executes not only Seminoles without trials, but also has drumhead trials for two British nationals, and gets himself in a heap of hot water for his disdain for international law. But I came to think that it's not just simple disdain and contempt on Jackson's part. Jackson as a boy was in the South Carolina Patriot Militia, was captured by British officers, and while held prisoner with his brother, an imperious British officer demanded that Jackson polish the British officer's boots. And Jackson says no. Well, Jackson later describes himself in his campaign biography as having said no and insisting on the privileges to which prisoners of war in civilized conflicts are entitled. The British officer didn't take kindly to that and goes to essentially kill Jackson with the British officer's sword. And Jackson manages to fend off the blow. But that moment is one in which Jackson is taking very seriously the norms of international law, and is using international law as a way to identify what counts as savagery. And he sees that in the British, and he sees it in Indian enemies as well. So the laws of war are actually mobilizing and motivating Jackson's passion. So I think that even in these irregular conflicts, which are predominant in the early republic, Indian conflicts in the on the western frontier in particular, we don't see a story in which the laws of war are irrelevant, though they formally don't apply. I think they're helping to make sense for the parties of the moral status of the conflict. We also see, and later in the book, we can talk about this more later, but later in the book, I describe the way in which the formal laws of war come to be applied formally to these irregular, unusual frontier-like conflicts, and that's an interesting story too. Now you asked about the military commissions, and can I talk about that for a minute? 'Cause
Oh,
that's a
yeah,
great,
no, that would be fine. Yes.
yeah. So the military commission story is one I think where we start to see in the 1840s a transition from the reprisal retaliation model you were talking about toward a criminal process model. In which violations of the rules of war are seen as the kinds of things that warrant punishment, even of enemy soldiers. Um, 1780s, when the enemy violates the laws of war, you retaliate against it. You may retaliate by executing the particular man who violated the rules, but you might retaliate by executing the guy you happen to have captured. And what we see in the 1840s is not a rejection or abandonment of the retaliation right, although there's some noise in the literature. You shouldn't retaliate against someone other than the guy who committed the infraction. But you start to see in Mexico people like Winfield Scott assembling military courts to engage in what looks a whole lot more like criminal adjudication of the violation and criminal punishment of the ostensible violator. And I came to think that that's a really important transition in the history of the laws of war. It's one that I think is propelled, at least in part, by the peculiar structure of American constitutional law. We have in our Constitution jury trial rights and guarantees of Article III courts. You have to have a reason. You have to have a justification for holding military tribunals that are different. And so we see the slow incremental construction of an idea of the war crime in the 1840s in Mexico and in the invention of the military commissions. And then one of the most interesting things for me was finding that military commission strand would lead right into the Civil War.
Yeah, and it was interesting. It seemed, the military commissions are highly problematic in the Mexican War, and if I'm remembering correctly, because the Mexican guerrillas in many cases are commissioned by the Mexican government, and so their style of warfare wasn't necessarily illegal or fell afoul of the laws of war. This was kind of something we decide as a part of our strategy. Is that part of what's going on?
Yeah, so it's the difficulty is that Scott and the American Army will capture some guy who's not in a uniform, who's armed or is clearly engaged in armed conflict, and he'll then pull out of his pocket a piece of paper that says he's commissioned by the Mexican government. And that raises the question, how to treat this guy. Because if he's a soldier, then under the 18th century rules of war, he's immunized against criminal prosecution. He's not subject to prosecution. If he's violated the rules, you could retaliate against him, but he's not prosecutable, at least under the orthodox traditional 18th century rules. And so when Scott treats Mexican guerrillas, who, notwithstanding the commission, as generally prosecutable, he's really pushing up against and chafing at the constraints of the 18th century tradition. It'd be one thing if he prosecuted them for particular forms of conduct, but it looks, as best as I can tell, that merely being an irregular combatant, even with one of these commissions, subjected you to criminal prosecution in the military commissions that Scott and the Americans set up in Mexico. And that's really chafing and pushing at the boundaries of the tradition. It's one of the moments where I think you can see Americans are frustrated with the idea that once you're in war, justice goes out the window. That's that original European idea that justice has to go out the window in order to manage and regulate the conflict. Set aside justice for the purpose of humanity is the foundational idea in the field, in the international law of war field. And here you have Winfield Scott bringing justice back in by developing the military commissions. And I don't know what to think of them and their legitimacy. I mean, it is true he's pushing at the boundaries of the field, and he's chafing at its constraints, and he's altering it. But remember that that's what almost everybody does in this domain. And Scott himself is in a bind. He's asked the Polk administration to go to Congress and get a jurisdictional fix that will give him jurisdiction to have military commissions in Mexico. One of his problems is he can't even prosecute American soldiers in Mexico. The Articles of War are such that serious crime by American soldiers was to be dealt with in the state courts, because the assumption in 1806, when the Articles of War were last amended, was that, of course, American armies would never be outside the United States. I mean, it was inconceivable. And so state courts are supposed to have jurisdiction over serious crime. But here we are in Mexico. There's no state court with jurisdiction. So when some American soldier commits a crime, there's nothing that can be done. In fact, there was some worry that committing serious crimes, including murder against Mexican citizens, civilian citizens, was becoming a favored way to get home by volunteers to the Mexican War who wanted to get back home, because you'd be dismissed, but you couldn't be prosecuted. So Scott has to create some kind, and Congress won't. The Polk administration won't push for this in Congress. Congress won't enact it, and Polk refuses to create military commissions by executive order. So Scott really is out there as an entrepreneur, experimenting with this new construction.
Let's move to the center of your book, and let's talk about this fascinating man, Francis Lieber, and his code, Lieber's Code, and the impulse behind Lieber's Code, what's guiding it, what its philosophy is, and its connection with the Emancipation Proclamation, which I found fascinating. So Francis Lieber is a Prussian national, fights for the Prussian army at the Battle of Waterloo, is wounded, comes to America, lives in Columbia, South Carolina for a while, actually owns slaves, has 3 sons, migrates to New York. One son stays behind, will eventually fight for the Confederacy, and becomes, in effect, a student and teacher of the laws of war at what is now Columbia School of Law, and then is tapped by Abraham Lincoln to write, in effect, a revised, updated laws of war for the Union Army, and which is then promulgated by Lincoln, has General Order 100. I think it was May 1st, 1863. But talk about this. But this is obviously what the Union Army will try and follow, but has obviously, as you detail, a massive effect on European war and then the conduct of war in the 20th century.
Well, I think this is one of the great little-known stories of the Civil War, and even those who've known the story, I think, haven't quite been able to explain what's going on. So the big question here is, why is it that in the middle of a conflict, the stronger side, so everyone knows the Union is the stronger side. They may or may not win in 1862-63, but they've got more men, they've got more industrial firepower and more industrial might. Why is it that the stronger side in the middle of a war would promulgate rules that purport, presumably, to constrain armed conflict? We don't see this almost anywhere else. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 come after the end of World War II, and that's the pattern we see. We see treaties and other kinds of efforts to constrain war coming out in the dismayed aftermath of conflict, not right in the middle of it. And the problem is even harder because in December of 1862, which is when the process begins that produces this code of rules for armed conflict, December 1862 is when the Lincoln administration is taking the gloves off. They've fired George McClellan, the famously cautious commander of the Union forces in the East, and they've moved on to a new strategy that they describe as much harsher. It's the end of what Lincoln called the Rosewater strategy of the first year and a half or so of the war. So what explains this? And the answer that the book tries to provide is that it's closely bound up in the project of emancipation. I came to think eventually that that's the only way to make sense of what's going on. One of the themes that I try to bring out in the first 75 years of American history is that there's a very interesting interconnection between America as a slave society on the one hand and the United States' law of war commitments on the other. It turns out that being a slave society is really dangerous in wartime. This is something that the British and the Americans are painfully aware of, beginning in 1775 and 1776. Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, one of the last things he does is proclaim to the slaves of Virginia that if they come over and fight with the British against their former masters, he'll offer them freedom. In the War of 1812, we see the same dynamic again with British raiding parties carrying off slaves throughout the Chesapeake and into the Deep South. Slaves were then offered guiding services to those raiding parties to show them around the byways and the backcountry roads, so that the British raiders could get to the plantations they wanted to get to. And all through the antebellum period, British military theorists and white Americans in the South are acutely aware of the vulnerability that being a slave society creates. When you have 4 million slaves in your population, that's a really dangerous thing when war arrives. And so from early on, one of the cardinal elements of the laws of war, according to people like Jefferson or John Quincy Adams, is that civilized states don't take slaves in wartime. That's one of the central limits that's articulated by American statesmen over and over again. And so that's what Lincoln is up against when in the summer and fall of 1862.
Now, let me just ask you a question. You say civilized state, so this was proscribed. You did not take the slaves of another state. Now, would that be because the fear of servile insurrection that you would be whipping up, or is it also a claim of civilian private property, or I guess it's both?
Yeah, I think it's really both. I mean, one trail that I follow, you see American jurists, people like Chancellor Kent from New York, or and Henry Wheaton, who's one of the early American international law jurists. You see these people taking strong property protection views early on in the development of property protections in international law. And for a while, I wondered if these northern jurists, Chancellor Wheaton, I think, is Rhode Island, and Kent is New York. I wondered early on if these guys were motivated in some ways by the United States' peculiar slavery concern, and I never found evidence of that. So I'm not sure that's right. But it is clear that the idea of private property being protected in wartime is one of the things that American jurists cite to when they defend the slaveholders' interests in wartime. But I think much more powerful is this anxiety that war would produce slave insurrection. And the stories of slave insurrection in Western culture go back to antiquity. They are typically nightmarishly violent conflicts when slave uprisings take place. And that's a real concern from 1775 onward. It's exacerbated by stories that come out of Haiti during the course of the Haitian slave revolts in the 1790s and into the early 19th century. So that's a really acute concern. The idea here is that stirring up slavery will produce humanitarian atrocity. That's the real concern. And so when the Lincoln administration turns to emancipation, along with that comes a real threat of humanitarian crisis. And so it's 3 weeks before the January 1st, 1863 Emancipation Proclamation that the administration commissions Lieber to write this code. And it's the slavery sections of the code that have long been mysterious and that I think makes sense once one sees the real project of the code.
Let me ask you. So we've talked about, and even you mentioned John Quincy Adams supporting the view that you didn't carry off slaves during wartime. Civilized nations did not. So when Lincoln, with the Emancipation Proclamation, and also this connection with Lieber's code, he's really reversing American precedent. And so the Southerners they're fearful of servile insurrection. They're fearful of the loss, I suppose, their wartime capacity as well, the slave labor could provide. But they're also, it seems, somewhat justified given their assumptions going in about what Lincoln is doing. That was certainly a new way of thinking about the problem to me. But let me ask you, with Lieber's code, who is Francis Lieber? I mean, what animates him to write the code? What is his approach to war? I mean, would you place him, and where would you place him intellectually? Is he a part of the Vattel, Grotius Enlightenment tradition, or is there something new going on in his mind with respect to war and how he drafts Lieber's code?
That's a great question, because the code that comes out, that the Union Army issues and Lincoln approves in the spring of '63 is drafted by this guy Francis Lieber. You gave a nice introduction to him a couple minutes ago. And Lieber is someone who really is at the intersection of a bunch of different currents of 19th century thought. He is anti-slavery, but as you point out, he owned slaves when he was in South Carolina as domestic servants. He is committed to a concept that he thinks of as Western civilization. He is, in some respects, a civil libertarian. I mean, he's written political theory treatises on civil liberty. He's also a fierce romantic nationalist in the mid-19th century fashion. He is wrapped up in what he thinks of as Prussian national destiny and also American national destiny. He thinks of these two collectivities as having world historical projects. And he thinks, and here we're getting close to the code, he thinks that war is one of the central ways in which Western civilization and nation states vindicate themselves. War isn't it isn't even a necessary evil. It's not just that it's war. He doesn't believe that war is a bad thing. He's fiercely opposed to pacifists. But he thinks that war is a positive good. It's a positive good because it delivers the martial virtue that keeps groups of people from declining into morally corrupt vice and moral decay. War is the great preserver of civilization and its values, Lieber thinks. Now, he's not a warmonger, strictly speaking. He opposes, for example, the Mexican War, which he thinks is a war designed to expand the slave South. And even though he's living in South Carolina at the time, he's opposed to that. Lots of people were, interesting. I mean, Lincoln famously, Winfield Scott, who's the fighting in Mexico, thinks the war's a bad idea. So Lieber's no warmonger, but he has a lot of respect for war. Many figures in the law of war tradition have been what I sometimes describe as secret pacifists. That is, they've been people who are opposed to war and are looking for ways to begin to limit it. And they're hopeful that the laws of war might be the camel's nose under the tent, or the beginning of a slippery slope towards limiting war altogether. But Lieber's not like that at all. Lieber's someone who admires war and wants to make sure that wars are fought in a civilized way that respects the traditions of Western civilization. And that's a really important feature of the story, that it's not a secret pacifist writing this code. It's someone who embraces war and martial rigor.
No, and I thought that was interesting. You note his connection with the German military thinker von Clausewitz, and you say he may be probably one of the few Americans at the time who was reading the famous military thinker, and who had the notion that war was politics by other means, and seems to set war apart. Also, from being a necessary evil, it's a thing governments do to further their own ends, and this seems to naturally kind of flow into Lieber's worldview. I thought that was an interesting part. I wanted to ask you with regard to Lieber's code, given that it becomes adopted by European governments in the 19th century, and as you mentioned, carries on into the 20th century as a part of the major international agreements on warfare. What guides his code? What does his code limit? What does it proscribe? And there seems to be an overarching military necessity that guides nations at war and justifies their conduct. But as we know with our own Constitution, necessity isn't necessarily necessity. It's fairly broad, and I think in war, so that would be even more the case. And I also found, I was just thinking as I'm reading through it, there are provisions in Lieber's code that I think we would we would just find unacceptable. And one of the things, it's almost an elastic clause, and I think it's in Article 52. I have it here. To save the nation is the paramount consideration, which it even seems that could justify things falling outside of the code even. And so it seems that there's a lot of problematic pieces. I mean, on one hand, we have this connection with the Emancipation Proclamation, an incredible document in American political military history, executive power history, and then we have Lieber's code. And maybe the concrete way to ask what I'm trying to get at is, so how does Lieber's code stand with regard to one of the most famous campaigns of the Civil War, which is Sherman's March to the Sea, where private property, civilian property, is destroyed in an immense way?
So these are more great questions. So I think the Clausewitz Connection is really indispensable to understanding Lieber's code, and it should be troublesome and dismaying to anyone who has hopes for the laws of war. Clausewitz is someone who famously condemns the laws of war and the European tradition with which it's associated to irrelevance in true warfare. Clausewitz leaves very little room for these trivial customs, this is his view, on the battlefield. He just doesn't think that they are, if you want to properly understand war in its pure essential form, these are not parts of the tradition on Clausewitz's view. And Lieber, because he's Prussian, actually his childhood looks much like the young career experiences of Clausewitz. They're both Prussians when Napoleon marches through Berlin in 1806. And their experience is one in which their projects are about revitalizing Prussia after this humiliating defeat of 1806. So the Clausewitz connection is very important, and you see traces of Clausewitz throughout the code. You see essentially the reference to the idea that war is politics by other means. And Lieber has a very interesting and very disturbing idea in the code, which is a Clausewitzian idea, and it's that short wars that are sharp wars may be more humanitarian in the long run. And here's the idea that maybe we don't want to tie our hands in armed conflict. Maybe we don't want limits and constraints that purport to make war more civilized or more humane. Because after all, those kinds of constraints may make the war drag on longer when some short, decisive blow might bring the war to a swift close. Moreover, they might encourage states to go to war when some other solution might be found. That is, if war isn't so bad, maybe states will make resort to it more often. So Lieber entertains this idea very seriously that the best way to humanize warfare is to reduce the regulations on it rather than increase them. And we see all of these ideas run through and animate the code. So the theory that my book advances for the code is that its central project is to license essentially a form of violence, which is the freeing of 4 million slaves in the South. That's a legitimating move is at the heart of the code, and that same legitimating or force expanding function is visible in any number of other sections not dealing with slavery in the code as well. So this is the solution to the December 1862 puzzle that I tried to present a couple of minutes ago, and we see it in any number of ways. For example, there are very few hard and fast limits on what armies can do. Almost every rule in the code that he articulates, rules for governing prisoners of war, for example, or attacks on cities, violence near civilians. All of these provisions in the code are haunted by a carve-out for military necessity exceptions. There's just a couple rules that don't have these carve-outs. One, interestingly, is the torture rule. The torture rule for Lieber is an absolute. It's not susceptible to a military necessity carve-out. So too the use of poisons in war, also a hard and fast rule. Interestingly, we know that Lieber privately thought that poisons should be subject to a military necessity exception. But that rule was, I think, too well established in the custom.
Would Lieber on torture have? Was it a strict no carve out? I mean, what if you were engaged with irregulars?
Oh well, that's interesting. So I mean, all we can say is that. Well, I want to say two things. One is the code itself purports to bind in conflicts between organized nations. Now, that in some sense means that its rules are on its own terms not applicable in irregular warfare with peoples who are not organized into nation states. And you might think of Indians or European wars of empire as the paradigmatic conflicts that are being excluded. Now, interestingly, though, Lieber's very clear, both, especially in his writings and in law lectures he gave during the war. He's of the view that even when the rules apply, there are limits that civilized states must abide by. So, for example, he loved to say over and over again that the Indians might roast American soldiers over fires, which would be a gross violation of the laws of armed conflict and which would warrant retaliation. But he said, we can't do the same. We can't do the same. It would, I think his view was that it would be dangerous to the moral compass to our moral compass to respond in kind to truly barbaric behavior by an enemy. Interestingly, I should say that one of the most interesting side features of this book, which is a strand that I try to bring out in it, there's good reason to think that Indian warfare practices, although they look horrific to our eyes often, and certainly look terrific to 19th century Americans and Europeans, oftentimes were really wonderfully designed systems for minimizing armed conflict, minimizing its destruction. Oftentimes much better designed than its European counterparts. So ritualized torture of prisoners was part of Indian warfare, as far as we can tell, going way back into the early modern period and before, as far as we know. But it appears that Indian warfare was oftentimes not nearly as destructive of communities as European warfare was. The ritualized torture was part of an organization of war by and among Indian tribes. So I don't want to buy into too much, too wholesale into the ideas that white Americans had about the barbarism of Indian warfare. It's more it was a conflict of rule schemes, two very different value systems clashing in irregular conflict on the frontier. Now, what I want to say about the structure of the code, though, is that this effort to license and constrain all at once really terrific acts of violence is at the heart of the code. That's the connection with Clausewitz, and that's what you were describing as the military necessity idea. Military necessity is the idea that runs through the code and justifies any number of really extraordinary powers that Lieber's code grants to armies in wartime. And that's an idea that is powerfully at odds with the 18th century European tradition, represented by people like Emmerich de Vattel, the lead jurist of the middle of the 18th century. Vattel had hoped that once parties could set aside justice and just regulate warfare for the purposes of humanity, that they'd be able to generate all sorts of hard and fast rules. These are hard and fast rules about not killing prisoners or not attacking civilians. They would be rules that would help the two sides in a conflict coordinate their behavior. And Lieber is suspicious of these rules. He's suspicious that about the idea of setting aside justice, and so he reinvokes the military necessity tradition, which is a tradition that itself reinvokes older ideas about justice and reimports some justice ideas into armed conflict. Because what the military necessity warrant does is it justifies behavior that is warranted by a legitimate, which is to say, a justified military end. And so justice creeps back in through the military necessity idea.
It was interesting. 'Cause I keep puzzling over Sherman's March to the Sea. You know the later episode of Sherman ordering, I think it was the Modoc Indians in Oregon, if I'm remembering correctly, and Sherman giving a particularly brutal order to kill I think it was the chief, and then any number of the braves, and then disperse the women and children across the area to, in effect, render the tribe impotent in the future. But I was also thinking of Sherman's March to the Sea in connection with Lieber's code being adopted, and I assume adapted, by Prussia later in the 19th century, and then thinking about the conduct of Germany in World War I, and in particular the von Schlieffen Plan, which sweeping through Belgium. Is the history that I've read, executing a lot of Belgian civilians who were seen to, thwart them or rise up against them. Of course, in Lieber's code, that's permitted. There's at least a way to rationalize it. And just thinking, could Lieber's code in embryonic form be part of the total wars or the tactics of total war we see? I will say World War II. I think that would be too much of a stretch, but even World War I and the massed armies. I mean, I just thinking about that connection that this is problematic, and particularly I think for those of us who the liberty of people and spontaneous order, that they develop their own code of laws, and thinking about. Of course, this is, war between nations is something that's just very complex and hard to deal with. But, thinking about there's a lot of problems and tensions as I read your book that I keep puzzling over, which is why I think it was, you've written such a great book. It raises so many questions and gives us so many ways to think about them.
Well, the Sherman to the Sea is one of the iconic moments at the beginnings of modern warfare. And one really interesting question is, what's the relationship between Lieber, Lincoln, and this code they produce on the one hand, and Sherman's March on the other? And historians for generations have looked at Sherman's March and concluded that therefore it must follow that the Lieber and his code were essentially irrelevant. They were sideshows. They're unimportant in the conflict. After all, I mean, the Union obviously wasn't paying any attention to them, goes this theory. Look at Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, I think this has been too easy and too complacent a conclusion. On the one hand, it ignores the important ways in which the code does shape the course of the war in the 2 years after its promulgation in the spring of '63. But it also imagines that the code must have been more humanitarian than it was. This is the point we've been bringing out and describing the connections between Lieber and Clausewitz and Lieber's ideas about war. But much of what Sherman orders on the course from Atlanta to the sea and then through South Carolina is consistent with the kinds of rules that Lieber's code includes. So that is to say, Sherman's March, at least as conceived by Sherman the strategist, is a march that complies with, and it vindicates in some sense the spirit of this fierce code that Lieber and Lincoln produce. Now, that's not to say that all the behavior by American soldiers to the sea was something that Lieber condoned. Lieber admired Sherman and admired the way in which he brought the war to the South. It was consistent with his short and sharp wars might be more humane idea. He was terribly worried, though, about the disorganization of Sherman's soldiers. These are Sherman's bummers, the foragers, who moved out from Sherman's armies as they moved across the landscape. And we know that all sorts of truly terrible violence took place in the course of that march. And Lieber was corresponding with one of Sherman's leading officers during that march, and writing down to a fellow named Hitchcock that he was greatly concerned with the kinds of disorganization that was going on. One thing that's going on here is that both the Code and Sherman's March to the Sea are experiments in newly decentralized armed forces. This is a moment where the tightly packed Napoleonic battle squares are giving way to much more dispersed ways of fighting, and that dispersion means that soldiers are further and further from the force of their officers and their commanders. It means that military discipline is increasingly hard to administer, and that is one of the things the Code is trying to accomplish, actually, is to bolster discipline in the Army. And one of the things that Sherman's March is showing is that the dispersion is getting ahead of the capacity to discipline. Now, one of the things that the Code tries to do is distinguish between those military efforts that are rationally connected to the advancement of the campaign, and those that are wanton and senseless violence on the other hand. And the Code tries to authorize rational advancement of military strategies and to disown and make unlawful wanton violence that has no such connection. And so there's lots of both in Sherman's March to the Sea, I think. But the Code is it's been described in the literature in the past as an occupier's code. That is, it's a set of rules that are pretty harsh on uprisings in occupied territory. It authorizes Union execution of those who would rise up, and so you can see connections to Prussian positions on occupation. First in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, and then again in 1914 and 1915 in Belgium.
Professor Witt, I think this has been a wonderful discussion about your book, Lincoln's Code: The Laws of War in American History. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.